November 3rd, 1961, 23:40 hours. Checkpoint, Charlie, West Berlin, Germany. Private First Class Anatoly Volkov stood motionless in the Soviet guard tower, his Mosin Nagant rifle resting against the concrete wall beside him. The November wind cut through his greatcoat like razors made of ice. Below, the Berlin Wall stretched into the darkness, concrete, barbed wire watchtowers, searchlights, a monument to ideology, a scar across a city that had once been whole. Anatoly had been stationed here for 6 months. 6 months of standing in towers, watching empty streets, smoking cheap cigarettes that tasted like cardboard, and listening to officers repeat the same warnings: the Americans are your enemies. They want to destroy the Soviet Union. They represent capitalist imperialism. Trust nothing they say, show no weakness. He was 22 years old, born in a village outside Minsk, raised on collective farms and Communist Youth League meetings, taught that the West was decadent, corrupt, waiting for any opportunity to attack the motherland. He'd believed it all, or at least he'd never questioned it, until he'd been assigned to Berlin and started seeing Americans every day. They weren't monsters. They were just soldiers, like him. Across the checkpoint, perhaps 30 meters away, an American MP stood at his post. Anatoly had been watching him for weeks now, different shifts, but often the same man, tall, young, probably not much older than Anatoly himself. The American wore his uniform properly, stood his post professionally, and sometimes, when he thought no one was looking, he looked as bored and cold as Anatoly felt. Tonight was particularly brutal. The temperature had dropped to -8 Celsius. Anatoly's fingers were numb, despite his gloves. His cigarettes had run out an hour ago, the cheap Soviet tobacco, but at least it had been something. Now he just stood there, shivering, counting the minutes until his shift ended at midnight. The American moved. Anatoly's attention sharpened automatically. Any movement had to be noted, assessed, potentially reported. But the American wasn't approaching the border. He was just stamping his feet, beating his arms against his sides, the universal language of a cold soldier trying to stay warm. Then, the American did something unexpected. He pulled out a pack of cigarettes, lit one, and looked directly at Anatoly's tower. Their eyes met across the checkpoint, across the ideological divide, across the Cold War itself. The American held up his cigarette pack. Even from 30 meters, Anatoly could see it was American tobacco, the real stuff, not the harsh Soviet brands. The American made a gesture, a question. Want one? Anatoly's training screamed at him. Fraternization with the enemy is forbidden. Report this immediately. Do not engage. But his body, frozen and desperate for nicotine, had different priorities. He hesitated, looked left, then right. His sergeant was in the guard hut, 50 meters away, probably asleep. No other officers visible. The checkpoint was quiet. It usually was at this hour. Just 2 soldiers, standing in the cold, doing a job neither had chosen, but both had to complete. Anatoly raised his hand slowly, nodded. The American smiled. Not a mocking smile, just the acknowledgement of 2 human beings, sharing a moment of mutual suffering. He walked forward, slowly, keeping his hands visible, approaching the white line painted on the ground that marked the boundary between East and West, between Soviet and American zones, between 2 worlds that were supposedly incompatible. He stopped exactly at the line. Didn't cross it, didn't violate the border. He held out the cigarette pack. Anatoly descended from his tower. Every step felt like betrayal of his training, his orders, his country, but also felt like the most human thing he'd done in months. He walked to his side of the white line. The 2 men stood facing each other, perhaps 1 meter apart. One Soviet, one American, both cold, both tired, both far from home. The American extended the cigarette pack across the line. Anatoly took 2 cigarettes. The American took his lighter, a proper American Zippo, and lit Anatoly's cigarette, the flame cupped against the wind. Cold, tonight, the American said, in English. Anatoly didn't speak English well, but he understood that. You got coffee up there? The American gestured toward the Soviet tower. Anatoly shook his head. No. No coffee. The American grimaced sympathetically. That's rough, buddy. We've got a thermos. Not great coffee, but it's hot. They stood there for perhaps 30 seconds, smoking in silence. Two enemies, who weren't really enemies. Two soldiers who'd been told to hate each other, but couldn't quite manage it when faced with the reality that they were both just young men doing jobs in the freezing cold. I'm Miller, the American said finally. Private first class. Detroit, Michigan. Anatoly, the Soviet replied carefully. Volkov. Privet. Minsk. Miller extended his hand across the white line. Anatoly stared at it. Shaking hands with an American was explicitly forbidden. It was fraternization. It was ideological compromise. It was everything his officers had warned against. He shook Miller's hand. The handshake lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then both men stepped back, returned to their respective sides, finished their cigarettes in silence. Miller gave a small wave and returned to his post. Anatoly climbed back into his tower. Nothing had changed. The wall was still there. The Cold War continued. The ideological divide remained absolute, but everything had changed. Because Anatoly had looked into the eyes of his supposed enemy and seen nothing but another cold, tired, homesick soldier, and that simple recognition had shattered 12 years of propaganda in 30 seconds. The Berlin Wall had existed for exactly 3 months when Anatoly and Miller exchanged cigarettes. Built beginning August 13, 1961, the wall represented the Cold War's most visible symbol, concrete proof that Europe remained divided between East and West, communism and capitalism, Soviet and American spheres of influence. By November 1961, the wall system included primary wall 3.6 meters high, death strip 100 meters wide, with raked sand to show footprints, guard towers positioned every 250 meters, manned 24 hours daily, anti-vehicle trenches, tripwire alarms, and armed patrols with orders to shoot anyone attempting to cross. The official East German position was that the wall protected the socialist state from Western fascist aggression. The reality was simpler. The wall existed to prevent East Germans from escaping to the West. Before its construction, approximately 3.5 million East Germans had fled westward. The wall stopped that exodus almost completely. But the wall also created an unexpected byproduct. It forced soldiers from opposing sides to stand within sight of each other, day after day, month after month. The official policy on both sides was identical: no fraternization with enemy soldiers, no conversation, no contact. Maintain professional distance and ideological purity. But policies designed in Moscow and Washington confronted the messy reality of human beings who couldn't maintain hatred for strangers they saw every day and who looked increasingly like themselves. Anatoly Volkov had been raised in a world where certain truths were absolute. The Soviet Union represented humanity's future. The West, particularly America, represented humanity's past: capitalist exploitation, imperialism, racism. His childhood education had been systematic. Young pioneers from age 9, Komsomol at 14, 2 years mandatory military service at 18. When Anatoly had received orders assigning him to Berlin, his commanding officer had been explicit: "You're going to the front line of the ideological struggle. The Americans will try to corrupt you with propaganda. Remember that it's all lies. Never forget that they're your enemies." Anatoly had arrived in Berlin expecting to hate the Americans. Instead, he'd found himself confused. The American sector didn't look like the impoverished capitalist dystopia he'd been taught to expect. The buildings were intact. The streets were clean. The civilians looked healthy. The American soldiers looked professional. More disturbing, the American soldiers looked normal. They maintained military discipline that would have been acceptable in any Soviet unit. They didn't look like the cartoon imperialist villains from propaganda posters. This created profound cognitive dissonance. Anatoly's training said Americans were enemies. His eyes said Americans were just soldiers like him. The cigarette exchange with Miller crystallized this tension. In 30 seconds of human interaction, Anatoly had experienced more genuine connection than months of communist ideology had provided. Miller hadn't seemed like an enemy. He'd seemed like someone who understood exactly what Anatoly was experiencing: the cold, the boredom, the isolation. That night, lying in his bunk, Anatoly couldn't sleep. For the first time since arriving in Berlin, Anatoly wondered if everything he'd been taught might be, if not entirely false, then at least incomplete. Private First Class David Miller had grown up in Detroit, Michigan. His father had fought in World War II, Pacific Theater, Marine Corps. Miller had enlisted in 1959, partly from family tradition, partly because factory work didn't appeal to him. He'd received orders to Berlin in early 1961. His briefing before deployment had been clear. Berlin was the Cold War's front line. Soviet forces represented genuine threat. Communist ideology sought to expand worldwide. The Soviets couldn't be trusted. Maintain vigilance. Never let your guard down. When the wall had gone up in August, Miller had been on duty, watching East German workers string barbed wire while Soviet soldiers supervised. He'd seen families separated, people standing on opposite sides of new barriers, unable to reach each other. The wall should have confirmed everything he'd been taught about communist brutality. But Miller had also started noticing the Soviet soldiers. They were young. They stood their posts professionally. They looked bored, cold, tired, homesick. They looked like every other soldier Miller had served with. The propaganda had prepared him for monsters. Reality presented him with conscripts. Miller had noticed one Soviet guard in particular, young, probably early 20s, who maintained proper military bearing, but also looked absolutely miserable in the November cold. When he'd seen the Soviet soldier shivering in his tower, Miller had felt something unexpected: sympathy. The cigarette exchange hadn't been planned. Miller had simply acted on impulse, a moment of shared human recognition that transcended politics. What surprised Miller was the Soviet soldier's response. The Russian had hesitated, but had ultimately accepted the gesture. They'd shaken hands across the white line. And in that moment, Miller had recognized something important. The Soviet soldier wasn't his enemy. That night, Miller wrote in a letter home, "The Russians here aren't what I expected. They're just soldiers like us. Maybe both sides have been taught to hate each other, but when you actually meet the people you're supposed to hate, it's harder than you'd think." The cigarette exchange should have been a single incident. Instead, it became the beginning of something neither soldier had anticipated: a careful, cautious, completely forbidden friendship. The next night, when their eyes met across the checkpoint, Miller raised his hand in brief wave. Anatoly, after hesitation, waved back. The following week, Miller brought coffee in a thermos. He left it on the American side of the white line. Anatoly stood in his tower for 5 minutes, knowing that accepting it violated every regulation. Then he descended, crossed to the line, picked up the thermos, and drank American coffee that was wonderfully hot. The exchanges became routine. Not every shift, but perhaps once or twice a week, when circumstances permitted. Cigarettes, coffee. Once, Miller brought a Hershey bar. Anatoly left a small carved wooden figure, a traditional Russian Matryoshka doll, inexpertly carved but recognizably crafted with care. Miller kept that wooden doll for the rest of his life. Their conversations were limited by language barriers, but they developed working vocabulary through repetition and gesture. Cold, coffee, cigarette, thank you, simple words, sufficient for basic human communication. Sometimes they didn't talk at all. They'd just stand on opposite sides of the white line, smoking, acknowledging each other's presence. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was companionable quiet of two people who understood each other's situation. Both men knew this was dangerous. If caught, they'd face immediate consequences. But the risk seemed worthwhile, because those brief moments provided something neither soldier had realized they'd been lacking: proof that the enemy was human. December 15th, 1961, 2:30 hours. Checkpoint Charlie. Anatoly heard shouting from the East German side. A figure was running toward the checkpoint. A man young, sprinting desperately through the death strip. Searchlights illuminated him. Sirens began wailing. East German Grenztruppen emerged from guard posts, rifles raised, shouting orders to halt. The runner ignored them, sprinting toward the white line that marked the border. This was an escape attempt. An East German civilian trying to flee to West Berlin. The Grenztruppen opened fire. Anatoly heard the crack of Kalashnikov rifles, saw muzzle flashes. The runner stumbled, but kept moving, now only 20 meters from the white line. Bullets kicked up dirt around him. Miller was on duty, on the American side. Anatoly saw him move toward the border, instinctively responding to someone in danger. But American regulations were clear. U.S. forces couldn't interfere in East German internal security operations. The runner reached the white line and collapsed, half his body in the eastern sector, half in the western sector. He'd been hit, blood spreading across his jacket. He was perhaps 20 years old, clutching his stomach, trying to crawl those final meters into West Berlin and safety. The Grenztruppen approached. Rifles aimed. They wanted to drag the wounded man back into East Berlin. Miller moved forward. Anatoly saw him hesitate at the white line, clearly torn between regulations and basic human decency. Then Miller stepped across the white line into the eastern sector, bent down, and dragged the wounded man fully into West Berlin. The Grenztruppen raised their rifles, aiming at Miller. An American soldier had violated the border. The Grenztruppen would be within their rights to open fire. Anatoly didn't think. He simply acted. He raised his rifle, aimed it not at Miller, but at the approaching Grenztruppen, and shouted in Russian, "Hold your fire. American is returning to his sector." The Grenztruppen hesitated, confused. A Soviet soldier was defending an American who'd just violated the border. Miller dragged the wounded man 3 meters into the western sector, then stood, raised his hands, and backed slowly into American territory. The entire incident had lasted perhaps 20 seconds. The Grenztruppen lowered their rifles, frustrated. The wounded man was now unambiguously in West Berlin. American medics were rushing forward. The crisis was resolving. Anatoly lowered his rifle, his heart hammering. He'd just aimed his weapon at East German forces to protect an American soldier. If his commanding officer had witnessed that, he'd be facing court-martial. Miller looked up at Anatoly's tower. Their eyes met. Miller gave a small nod, acknowledgement, gratitude. Anatoly nodded back. Later that night, they met at the white line. Neither man said anything. Miller extended his hand. Anatoly shook it. "Thank you," Miller said quietly. "Posalusta." Anatoly replied, "You're welcome." The wounded German survived. He would eventually rebuild his life in freedom, carrying with him the memory of 2 soldiers, one American, one Soviet, who'd chosen humanity over orders. December 16, 1961. 9 o'clock hours. Soviet military headquarters, East Berlin. Anatoly stood at attention before Lieutenant Colonel Fedorov, who was reading an incident report. "Private Volkov," Fedorov said finally. "The Grenztruppen filed a report stating that you aimed your weapon at them." Anatoly's stomach clenched. "I aimed my weapon to prevent escalation, Comrade Colonel." The American was withdrawing. Firing at him would have created international incident. "The Grenztruppen believe you were protecting the American." "I was preventing unnecessary violence, Comrade Colonel." Fedorov set down the report. "There are also reports that you have been engaging in unauthorized contact with American personnel, exchanges of cigarettes and coffee." Anatoly stood rigidly, waiting for punishment. Instead, Fedorov pulled out a pack of cigarettes, Western cigarettes, and lit one. He smoked in silence, then spoke more quietly. 20 years ago, I was on the Eastern Front. We captured German prisoners. They were terrified. They'd been told we'd torture them. Instead, we gave them food and water. One young German kept staring at me. Finally, he asked, "Why don't you kill us?" I told him, "Because the war is over for you." That German survived. Became a teacher. Years later, I received a letter from him, thanking me for showing him that enemies could be human. He said that moment changed his understanding of the world. Fedorov crushed out his cigarette. I'm not encouraging fraternization, Private Volkov. Regulations exist for good reasons. But what you did last night, preventing violence, that required courage. You risked court-martial to prevent bloodshed. I'm not going to punish you. But be careful. Not all officers share my perspective. Keep your exchanges discreet, and remember that your first loyalty is to Soviet forces. The American you protected filed a report praising a Soviet soldier who demonstrated exceptional professionalism. Both sides need more soldiers like you. Anatoly could barely process what he was hearing. Yes, Comrade Colonel. Thank you, Comrade Colonel. March 1962. Miller received orders, transfer to Frankfurt, departure in 2 weeks. He should have been relieved. Instead, Miller felt conflicted, because leaving Berlin meant leaving Anatoly. Over 5 months, Miller had come to value those brief moments of human connection. Anatoly had become someone Miller respected, someone whose perspective had changed how Miller understood the Cold War. On his final night at Checkpoint Charlie, Miller came prepared. He'd purchased a decent American watch and written a letter. Serving across from you reminded me that soldiers on both sides are human beings. Thank you for the cigarettes and the reminder that enemies can treat each other with dignity. Respectfully, David Miller. When Anatoly's shift coincided with his own, Miller placed the watch and letter on the ground, stepped back, and saluted. Anatoly descended, examined the watch, pocketed the letter. Then he pulled out something he'd been carrying, a photograph of himself in dress uniform. On the back, written in careful English, some enemies become friends. Some friends were always friends. Just waiting to meet. Be safe. Anatoly Volkov. He placed the photograph on the line. Miller picked it up, studied it, folded it carefully, and placed it in his wallet, where it would remain for the next 50 years. The two men stood facing each other for the last time. Then, simultaneously, they each took one step forward and shook hands directly over the painted boundary dividing their worlds. Miller returned to his post. Anatoly climbed back into his tower. Both men stood their remaining watch in silence. The Berlin Wall would stand for 28 years. From 1961 until 1989, it divided Berlin and symbolized the Cold War. At least 140 people died attempting to cross it. But the wall also created thousands of moments like Miller and Anatoly's, small forbidden instances of human connection between soldiers who were supposed to hate each other but couldn't quite manage it. Soviet and American soldiers shared cigarettes across white lines at checkpoints throughout Berlin. They developed hand signals for basic communication. They occasionally prevented violence through mutual understanding. These interactions didn't end the Cold War. They didn't tear down the wall, but they accomplished something perhaps equally important. They preserved individual soldiers' humanity in circumstances designed to deny it. November 9, 1989. The Berlin Wall fell. David Miller, now 50 and long retired, watched the news from Detroit. He saw Berliners attacking the wall with hammers, saw East and West Germans embracing, and he thought about Anatoly Volkov. Miller had kept the photograph Anatoly had given him, the formal Soviet military portrait, now faded but still clear. He'd carried it through decades, a reminder of when two supposed enemies had recognized each other's humanity. On impulse, he wrote a letter addressed to Anatoly Volkov, formerly Soviet Army, stationed Berlin 1961 to 1962. He sent it to the Soviet embassy, knowing it was unlikely to reach its destination. 6 months later, he received a response. Dear David, I received your letter. I am grateful you remembered me. I never forgot you. I often thought about our cigarette exchanges. They meant more than you might realize. In a world where I was taught to hate Americans, you showed me that Americans were just people. That simple recognition changed how I understood the world. I still have the watch you gave me. It stopped working years ago, but I kept it. I also kept your letter. My children found it once and asked what it was. I told them it was a reminder that enemies can become friends when they choose to see each other's humanity. The wall is gone now. The Cold War is over. The ideologies that divided us have proven less permanent than the simple human connections we made despite them. With respect and old friendship, Anatoly Volkov. Miller read the letter 3 times. Anatoly had survived, had built a good life, had kept the watch and letter, just as Miller had kept the photograph. They never met in person. But they maintained correspondence over the years. Two old soldiers who'd once stood on opposite sides of a painted line and chosen humanity over ideology. In 1995, a journalist researching Cold War personal narratives interviewed David Miller about his service in Berlin. "There was a Soviet soldier I'd developed an understanding with," Miller explained. "We'd share cigarettes sometimes, against regulations, but we did it anyway. When I went across that line to help the wounded man, I looked up at that guard tower and I saw Anatoly raising his rifle, not at me, but at the East Germans. He protected me. A Soviet soldier risking court-martial to protect an American." The journalist asked why Anatoly would take such a risk. Miller thought for a moment. "Because we'd established that we were human beings, not just ideological enemies. We'd shared cigarettes and acknowledged each other's existence as individuals. When crisis happened, that human connection was stronger than political division." The article circulated widely, eventually being translated into Russian and published in Moscow newspapers. Anatoly read it with tears in his eyes. Miller had told their story honestly, not as propaganda, but as account of human connection transcending political enmity. Checkpoint Charlie still exists, preserved as historical site. The guard towers are gone. The white line remains. But now people cross it freely. A small plaque near the checkpoint, installed in 2003, reads, "Here, where soldiers of opposing nations once stood guard across an ideological divide, small acts of human kindness occasionally bridged the gap that politics created. Cigarettes shared, coffee exchanged, hands shaken across white lines. These gestures didn't end the Cold War, but they preserved individual humanity within it." Neither Miller's nor Anatoly's names appear on the plaque. Their story is one among thousands. Small instances of human beings refusing to hate strangers they'd been ordered to consider enemies. David Miller died in 2015, aged 75. In his belongings, his family found a wooden box containing a faded Soviet military photograph, several letters in Russian, a broken watch, and a handwritten note. Proof that enemies can become friends when they choose humanity over hatred. Save these. Remember that walls can be crossed, and sometimes the most important act of resistance is refusing to hate someone you've been ordered to hate. Anatoly Volkov is, as of this writing, still living in Minsk at 92. When asked about his Cold War service, he speaks about a young American soldier who offered him cigarettes during a Berlin winter. "Miller taught me that Americans were human," Anatoly said in a 2018 interview, "not through propaganda, but through the simple act of sharing warmth with a stranger. Everything I'd been taught was false, and I learned that truth from a cigarette offered across a white line." The Cold War was about systems, ideologies, incompatible visions. But Miller and I weren't systems. We were just two young men trying to get through military service without losing our humanity. That choice, to see enemies as human beings, is what defeats hatred. The Berlin Wall stood for 28 years. The cigarette Miller offered me lasted 5 minutes. But the wall is gone, and I still remember that cigarette and what it represented. The possibility of choosing humanity when ideology demands enmity. Miller gave me tobacco, but he gave me something more valuable, proof that the propaganda was false, that Americans could be decent, that enemies could recognize each other's humanity. The Cold War is over. The Soviet Union is gone. The ideologies that divided us have proven less permanent than the human connection. Miller and I established through cigarettes and coffee and shared misery of standing guard in November cold. That connection proved more important than any ideology, and it remains available to anyone willing to see enemies as human beings. All it requires is the courage to offer cigarettes across white lines. The cigarette exchange, at Checkpoint Charlie in November 1961, accomplished nothing measurable. The Cold War continued. The Berlin Wall remained standing for decades. But for two young men standing guard over a painted line, sharing tobacco in the freezing cold, that moment changed everything. It proved that enemies could be human, that divisions could be crossed, and that choosing connection over hatred was possible even in circumstances designed to prevent it. Miller and Anatoly didn't end the Cold War, but they proved it could be transcended through individual choice, moment by moment, cigarette by cigarette, until walls fall and divisions heal, and former enemies recognize each other as what they'd always been, human beings who were never truly enemies, just strangers who'd been told to hate each other, but chose connection instead.